Fighting propagandistic lies with more lies rarely works and runs the risk of eroding trust in your credibility and undermining your cause. However, there is a role for so-called black disinformation in wartime. This deliberate dissemination of false or misleading information can be highly effective as part of a military operation. Information campaigns with the intent to deceive, manipulate, or undermine an adversary during warfare or conflicts as a tactic is used to gain strategic advantage by sowing confusion and destabilizing the enemy. Today, I'm going to be talking about some classic examples of this and some of the characters that are deeply immersed in this kind of black propaganda with Peter Pomerantsev, who has become an expert in this area. Peter is a Soviet-born British journalist, author, and TV producer. He's written 2 books about Russian disinformation and propaganda, and he has a third here, which is absolutely fantastic. I highly recommend people read that, and it is called How to Win an Information War, and it focuses on the propagandists who attempted to outwit Hitler. Peter, welcome back to the channel.
Thank you for having me.
It is very timely because we are in the midst of another information war, whether we realize that or not, in Russia. I think in many of the reviews of your book, and indeed in the book itself, you do draw parallels to the present day. Now, I have to ask, was this a sort of labor of love, or do you feel that this is a book that has huge topical relevance where we are at and may help in the struggle to counter Russian disinformation and propaganda?
So look, my point of view is always going to be about the present. That I'm not a historian. I'm interested in what we do today. And my books have always been sort of indivisible from my work at actually Johns Hopkins University now and other places trying to understand how do we defeat disinformation. So I've never really, and whether it's labor of love, I mean, the reason I'm fascinated by propaganda is not for academic reasons. It's because at a fundamental level, I'm very sensitized to the way we are influenced by language, by culture, for various reasons that I explore partly in this book. And also, I've seen close up several countries that I've lived in, families torn apart by these things. This is not an abstract sort of conversation for me. So I don't know love or hate, but definitely passion. It's definitely not just an exercise in historiography. So that's and the book, yes, the book is 20% the present day, 80% the past. It's constantly jumping between the Second World War and the killing fields of Eastern Ukraine, and essentially thinking, what out of the lessons of World War II could we use today?
And the book starts with an extraordinary description of Sefton Delmer, who found himself as a schoolboy in the First World War in a German boarding school, the only British student in the school, and firsthand witnessed the triumphalism, dare I say, even put a label on there, the sort of maybe even bloodlust you could call it, but this incredible sense of a country at war that is everyone's engulfed in that sort of triumphant sort of feeling. We know the First World War did turn into the sort of quagmire that it did, and those feelings of triumphalism quickly disappeared. Is there a parallel to say, maybe not so much the full-scale war where Putin's tried to downplay things, but certainly the taking of Crimea seemed to release that similar triumphalism that people may have witnessed at the start of the First World War?
Yes, I mean, it's interesting because both the start of the First World War and the start of the Second World War, there's very different reactions on there. So the start of the First World War, there is quite a lot of enthusiasm, and Delmer describes it in great detail. And you're right, people enjoy war and winning wars. They prefer to be given the feeling that there's not much blood involved. And a lot of propaganda is about kind of like minimizing the sense of blood and maximizing the sense of glory. And Delmer has a very unromantic view of human nature. He thinks that propaganda releases things that were always there. He doesn't believe people are sort of manipulated so much as have their darkest selves legitimized. But what he's very good at noting is that people have different selves. So the same people who are tub-thumping jingoists one moment can then almost put on a different mask and be these skeptics making these sarcastic jokes about the war. And he noticed that in himself. He is a Brit, bullied in his German school. He's 10 years old when the First World War begins, beaten up and picked on the way you'd expect an enemy school child to be. And then he has these remarkably sort of honest descriptions where he talks about how he's caught up in the enthusiasm of the war, how he enjoys singing the war propaganda and marching along with the other kids. And he's sort of asking himself, like, who am I? Who's the real me? And one of the reasons I find him so fascinating is that even though he goes on to do all these sort of dirty, innovative, amoral, sometimes incredibly moral things during the war, his understanding of propaganda is rooted in the way propaganda affects our identity. And I suppose his idea is that what propaganda does is give people satisfying roles to perform. Satisfying because they're emotionally satisfying. Satisfying is because they can give you a sense of who you are in a confusing time. So it's a very performance-driven understanding of propaganda. It's not about disinformation or cognition. It's about identity and a very theatrical idea of identity that he has. And I think today that feels so relevant when online we're constantly performing our political selves. You don't have to go to a rally to get involved in a kind of online mob, liking, retweeting, saying the same things, while all the time feeling that we're actually expressing our individuality, but actually we're just copying each other. Delmore would have loved all of that. If anything, we now have, through online dynamics, these kind of snapshots of how people transform in a very deeply imitative way, because for him, it's people are imitating each other in these moments, while all the time maybe thinking that they're being very individual, very, very individualized. And his theory of propaganda is that we never stop acting. Any social role, any social interaction, any learning of a language entails the putting on of some sort of costume. The question is, are we putting on that costume and that role and then allowing the propagandist to be in charge? Or do we put on a costume and, I've always loved this English phrase, to act yourself, and being in charge, both in terms of our interests and our personalities, of the performance. And he would say, I think, that the propagandists, the catch is they give you satisfying roles to perform, but they're doing it in their interests. And he's sort of always encouraging people in his work, which we'll explore, to say, yes, you're going to be you can play a different role. You don't have to be the Aryan, the Volksgenosse, the SS man. You can be the family man, the soldier, who has a different set of roles and loyalties. The Catholic, the good Catholic, So he's always pulling people into their other selves and their other identities and their other loyalties. So I thought, that was one of the reasons I decided to write the book, when I realized that he had a sense of what propaganda is, which feels very current today, which I could relate to in many ways. And that was one of the two reasons why I decided to write the book.
And one thing I struggle with, which I think the book has certainly helped me try to find a path through this, and that is struggling to understand people who think of themselves as moral, but who commit heinous, immoral acts. And propaganda has that dual role, doesn't it? In the way you've described it there. It can convince someone who perhaps wants to behave in a moral fashion that the monstrous acts they're being asked to perform are actually moral, are a form of loyalty to the state, are whatever. So on the one hand, it's corrupting people whose behavior in other circumstances may be different in a different moral framework, with people exhorting them to behave in a different way. But then there's another type of person who may have a better sense of what is right and what is wrong, but these propagandistic roles allow them to absolve themselves of responsibility, allow themselves to fall into a pattern, and in some cases, at the extreme ends, maybe even revel in the immorality that they're being asked to perform, because they still have a sense of the innate wrongness of it, but are being absolved from, that framework of behaviors which formerly they would have perhaps been held to.
Yeah, I think propaganda can definitely and often aims to absolve people of the weight of responsibility and to a certain extent of individuality as well. I mean, somebody who wrote about this a lot was Erich Fromm, who was a sort of German psychoanalyst and cultural critic, writing at this, he was in Colombia during the Second World War. He was exiled. He writes this a lot. He's got a famous book, Escape from Freedom, where he describes it as that: the totalitarian system allow people to escape from responsibility, from a sense of yourself, which is very hard because you have to take all these burdens and all these decisions and confront your own death and all these kind of things, and allowed you to kind of like hide away in, well, everybody's doing it, so it's okay, at the very banal level, but which was also given up of your agency. And Nazi propaganda talked about this quite openly, by the way. I mean, so Goebbels always said that the aim is to end the era of the individual. The individual is meant to morph with the mass, with the folk. That was, and all their mass spectacles. I mean, just think of the visual side of Nazi propaganda. It's all about subsuming the individual in the mass, and then your individuality is sort of merged with the Führer's, who's the one individual that is celebrated. You are the Führer and he is you, sort of thing. So that was their kind of theory. And Delmer in the Second World War is very, very conscious of that. And his aim is to always inspire people's individuality, while always understanding that people need community. He's not, when he does his Second World War work, he never frames it around kind of heroism. It's all about do things in your own interests because everybody's doing them in their own interests as well, sort of take. Don't be afraid to be an individual. Everybody's actually doing it, would sort of be his framing. Because he was very aware that exhorting people to rebel, to stand up to this totalitarian regime was not going to work with a lot of people, because most people are conformist at best or actually enjoying the Nazi propaganda.
That's right. And some people are benefiting, of course. I mean, it would have been quite the same people who may have been aware that this is not good, but if it wins, we'll go along with it. They're benefiting financially. The system, the industrial base, even elements of society are changed so that conformism pays and non-conformism doesn't. I mean, at the very least, you're going to lose your job or your status, your position in society. At worst, you're going to start be punished for your individualistic behavior. We see the same thing in Russia now in the totalitarian slide.
Yes, definitely. But that's also, I'd say, that's also strange. That could also be a vulnerability, because if it stops being in your interest, does that mean you do something else? I mean, very simply, Russian soldiers are being sent into the meat grinder. The Ukrainians do all sorts of communication exercises to go, look, you're dying for Putin. Do you really want this? I mean, that's the very basic level, with a fair amount of success. I mean, not a huge amount of surrenders, but quite a lot comparatively to other conflicts. So the Nazis were actually very frustrated when they saw people doing Nazi things for the wrong reasons. Well, not all of them. Heydrich was, for example, sort of the gruesome, one of the architects of the Holocaust. He was a true believer. And, when he saw how people were reporting on their neighbors for not being Nazi enough, but just so they could get their flat, basically. A lot of this happened. There's a lot of denunciations, a culture of denunciation, but usually done for self-interest. And he get really frustrated. He's like, they're doing this for the wrong reason. They're meant to denounce each other for Nazi reasons, not for self-interest. This is bad. And Delmer's always playing on this. So yes, clearly we see Putin scrambling to set up a new system of self-interest and loyalty, And the Russian system has always been about that. It's always been about, like, if you want to get on, you've got to play along. And scrambling to do that. I'd say that's a potential vulnerability as well, because what happens when that self-interest starts to stumble?
So there's two key things I got out of the book, two key wedges. And I think both the propagandist and the anti-propagandist is looking for wedges in their opponent's behavior, areas of disagreement One would seem to be based on values, and that is to look at the innate conflict between the Prussian aristocratic military class and the Nazi party, the sort of brash, violent, amoral sort of group. And that's a split in society that you could perhaps drive a wedge through. The other one, as you say, is corruption, nepotism, this kind of area, which affects individuals' lives. That has a curious parallel, of course, in the Navalny strategy. Whereas in this instance, Navalny didn't go after the system as such, but went after those who are abusing or taking advantage of the system. One might label it slightly more superficial, but can we draw parallels in those strategies?
So there are parallels and then very, very big differences. So the similarity is in the use of language. So Delma and Navalny were very aware that you had to label the Nazis or Putin's political party, United Russia, in a certain way to separate them from the rest of the population. So Delma came up with the word, the Parteicommune, the party commune. And he's constantly, a lot of his media is about the party commune and how, well, which he means Nazi officials, are doing things in their own corrupt interests and don't care about everyone else. Navalny called them the party of crooks and thieves. Very, very successful bits of branding. Doing exactly that, creating a rift. However, the huge difference is Navalny would do stories about corruption of Russian officials in order to make people feel outraged and to want to do something about it, to stamp out corruption. Delma wants the absolute opposite. Delma wants to encourage corruption because that'll hobble the Nazi economy. So when he's doing outrage, when the hosts of his show are sort of being outraged by Nazi corruption, his aim is to get Germans to be more corrupt. Germans are meant to go, well, if they're doing it, I'm going to do it. And frankly, I think that's a better war tactic. I mean, what has saved Ukraine several times in this war has been Russian corruption. We don't want less of it, we want more of it. I mean, most famously, the money that was meant to go. I mean, the double irony is just almost too much. The money that the Kremlin gave to the FSB to corrupt Ukrainians was used in a corrupt way by the Russian FSB for themselves. So there's so many levels there. So we want more corruption in Russia. We don't want less corruption in Russia. The one thing we don't want is the system working efficiently. So we want less corruption in the West so that we can, fence off and close Russia's roots and tendrils across the world. That's what we really want to stop. But inside of Russia, it's been a bit of a boon. So a very big difference in that sense. So Delmer is not interested in starting some sort of revolutionary movement in Germany. He starts broadcasting to Germany in 1941. He thinks it's way past the time when it was possible to inspire any positive political developments in Germany. His aim is sort of destructive, essentially. He wants to sort of undermine Nazi propaganda. That's his aim, to get under its skin and start to pull it apart.
And there's an analogy, of course, in Russian propaganda, which has changed a little bit during the war, and their internal propaganda is trying to exhort people to take action, whereas before it was really primarily focused on inaction. But when it focuses on the West, almost the point of all Russian external propaganda is to try and dissuade allies from being united, organized, funding Ukraine, coming up with armaments. Almost everything is pointed towards defunding, desupporting Ukraine, with, of course, very mixed results. I mean, one can't say it's an entire failure because of what's been going on and the delays in the EU and the blockages we see in the US as well. Not entirely unsuccessful, but at the same time, in the long view, do you think there's some similarity in that destructive propaganda? And is it likely to achieve its goals in the long run?
It all depends on us. It's such a good question. I mean, it depends on how we respond. Propaganda can delay, distract, dismay, undermine, but at the end of the day, it's successful when it catches a kind of a wave and steers it in its own direction. I'm still unsure which way the wave is going. I mean, at the moment we see a lot of the wave in Europe turning towards more hawkishness, towards an understanding that we need to produce our own defense capacities, that this is a long-term threat, that Putin is not a man you can do business with. So if anything, the wave is in the other direction. The problem is the wave is going very slowly. And by this time next year, well, by autumn, really, we may be in a very perilous position where it's just too late. In America, the wave is going in the other direction. In America, the wave is going towards greater isolationism and an abandonment of the America that we have known the last, well, century, 60 years, definitely. So they're going with the grain of things. I mean, it's quite ominous because Russia's dream, of course, is the breakup of America, or the point where it just becomes ungovernable. And as we all prepare for this election and its consequences, I mean, the conversation that everybody's having in America, or not everybody, the conversation that some in America are having are very seriously about how this project becomes ungovernable, how the states just start doing kind of their own thing. And even if they're formally they're still part of one union, essentially it stops functioning in many ways as one, certainly for any kind of serious political will. And we always used to laugh at Russia. I mean, they've always been trying to do like independent Texas movements. Now it feels that they understood something quite fundamental about America's vulnerabilities. It had always been, I think, Obama's great worry that the danger for America isn't so much a dictator, you know, which is what everybody obsesses over, but it's somebody who gets into power who is so untenable for many people that they just start to split off. And you know, let's say a certain type of wannabe autocrat gets into power, you could see some states just going, well, we're not going to be part of this. And that won't be a smooth journey, you know, legally it'll be a very complicated journey, but this compromise of America depends on so much goodwill to make it work, that it seems that Russia's dream of America, which is incapable of decision-making and action, is on its way. And so did Russia cause that? Of course not. It's about like effective propaganda sees the trend and then make sure the trend goes in its direction. And, you know, some trends are going in their direction.
And it also utilizes, I guess, technology, because if we go back to Saft and Dalma, he's using the relatively new medium of radio. And we'll go into the detail in a minute, because I find it extraordinary how he managed to intersperse into the broadcasts the fine details of daily life to convince people that that was an authentic voice, that was coming from inside the establishment rather than from the outside. And that's an extraordinary thing to pull off. But it's also through a novel medium. So people's critical judgment and framework, the culture of cynicism around broadcast material tends to be lower. It hasn't evolved in the early stages of technology. Aren't we also going through that same process with digital media at this point? The fragmentation, the gullibility in many senses that we see exhibited and then turning into this political divisiveness you've described is perhaps because we're in the early stages of this digital revolution.
Yeah, yes, I mean, without a doubt. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why the book or Delma's experiences feel relevant. I mean, what people going through in the sort of first half of the 20th century with these new media is similar to what we're going through now. First, a dream of that radio would bring the world together. There's these lovely poems and paeans written how radio, a bit like social media, would end all wars because people would speak to each other and understand each other. I mean, just as we had the sort of, you know, rose-tinted view of social media when it emerged, it's time of the Arab Spring, you know, this idea that it would just bring people together in a great way. And suddenly we see the dark side and how it can be misused by authoritarian figures, Stalin, Hitler. Father Coughlin was a very interesting sort of version of that in the US, a kind of anti-Semitic priest who was the first shock jock, essentially. And that was with radio, and obviously we see the same thing with online world. First, it seems like a democratic tool, and very quickly we see that it can be used for the opposite, and now it's largely used for the opposite. So that's in that sense, a lot of similarities, and the way that new mediums allow for the creation of new identities. You know, just like then, we see media being used as a way to kind of proliferate new versions of yourself and new group identities, you know, new loyalties. The Nazis produced something called the Volksempfänger, which is a very sort of like, it was a cheap radio basically, and they sold it at very affordable prices, and Germans became the most radio listening nation in Europe. That was very conscious. They wanted to take Hitler's rallies and put them in your living room. And they saw it as a way of creating a unified identity. They actually did a lot of radio innovation. They essentially helped invent the sort of the call-in show. They had these shows, which were music shows, and people would call in, tell a story, or write in, tell a story, and have a song dedicated to them, which is another way of bringing people into a kind of communal experience. And of course, with social media, you know, I think we don't have to, you know, think very hard to notice how it's creating new conspiratorial communities, new political communities, new religious communities, which undermine the old bonds. You know, the Nazis were basically saying, forget the church, forget your regional loyalties. Even, I mean, the army was very hard for them. You know, that was always a hard one, but even the army, they were trying to be, forget, you know, let's make this a Nazi army with mixed success. And, you know, social media is doing that as well. Like, forget all your other things. You're now a member of QAnon, or you're now a Proud Boy, or you're now one of these online movements. That is now who you are.
In that sense, I've been interviewing or trying to interview people who are experts in weaning people off cults and deconditioning, and there seems to be some sort of relevance to that in this modern phenomenon. It also tells us that it's incredibly hard. You know, even working one-on-one, it's not an easy process to wean individuals out of that, and some do not want to be because their entire identity is bound up in that. How did Sefton Delmer think that he could break apart these bonds? How did he go about sort of trying to find the weak spots, not just in sort of communities on a macro level, but, you know, individuals and their belief systems and their loyalties to, say, the Nazi regime?
So he never sat down and summarized all his ideas in a grand theory. I think during the war, nobody had time. And then after the war, he moved on to other things. You couldn't write about this for a long time. Also, I just never think they systematized everything into one theory. They were just experimenting all the time. But having gone over his memoirs, having gone over the declassified archives, and that's all down to a historian called Lee Richards, who does amazing work unearthing the PW archive, which has the sort of daily brainstorms and correspondence. And most importantly, you know, Sefton Delmer, one should note, was running dozens of radio stations broadcasting into Nazi Germany during the war. Having gone over the transcripts of a lot of the German ones, which are the ones we're most interested in, I begin to see a pattern, a kind of almost an algorithm that's implicit in his work. But this is very much me kind of making sense of a body of work and saying, okay, this is what repeats. Firstly, what doesn't work? He doesn't think that liberals preaching into their own echo chamber works. So he had done some work with the BBC German service and thought it wasn't doing a good job. He thought it was just emigres talking to one another, liberals talking to one another, absolutely pointless if you want to reach these massive people who are enjoying the Nazi performance. So that's very important because we're kind of in the same place today, where a lot of pro-democracy media thinks that preaching, giving people the facts, talking down to them will somehow penetrate the emotional power of all this authoritarian propaganda that we see around us. So number one, don't do that. That's very important because most of the British counter-propaganda was doing that. So his first thing was like, don't do that. It's already a big thing. What not to do is already a big thing. Now, to get into the Nazi bubble, number one, you've got to compete on the same space of visceral emotion. So he sets up radio stations that are full of these furious, often far right, further right than the Nazis. Let me rephrase that. Not further right in terms of, how do we describe what they are? That's a good point. They're not further right than the Nazis. They're a different sort of right to the Nazis. They're representatives of military racism rather than Nazi racism, but pretty vile is what I'm saying. Not nice people. I'm not sure you can be further right than Nazis. Like a different type of right then.
Well, I don't know. I once shared lived in a communalka where someone was a member of the LDPR, Zhirinovsky's party. He got thrown out for extremism, and I didn't believe that was possible. So, yeah, sometimes it is possible to be more extreme than the extremist.
Fine. Well, okay. But what I mean is these were not liberals preaching to things. These were created characters at the start of Delma's career who were articulating a level of anger that was, in his own words, smearing the Nazis themselves with a layer of filth as thick as they'd covered the Jews. He was re-engineering Nazi propaganda back at them. And in doing that, what he was doing was taking away the monopoly over strong emotions that the Nazis had. So that's stage one. You've got to be on that territory. If you're not going to get anywhere near that. You've got to dive into the same operating theater of anger and desire that the other side is working on. But his aim was not to create a parallel movement. So again, Navalny was very good at that. Navalny was stoking anger, resentment, envy, often quite negative feelings, very powerful ones. But Navalny wants to create a movement. Delma does not want to create a movement. He's doing something actually the opposite of that. And this is where it starts to get interesting, because I think so far, these are things that almost everybody's aware of, just nobody does it well. So when he's presenting his radio content to the King of England in 1941, he describes what he's doing as pushing Nazi propaganda just one step further into the ridiculous, where it starts to hurt the Nazis themselves. He doesn't mean satire. The shows weren't meant to be satirical. You were meant to listen to them seriously. They were probably laughing, but they weren't. He wasn't just taking the mickey out of Nazi propaganda. He was doing something much more subtle. He was exaggerating it and distorting it in such a way that people would be, in a sense, made conscious or shocked into understanding how fake and fabricated it is. Now, this is a very subtle moment, and it's worth dwelling on. I think we saw something similar. I don't know if how many of your viewers saw this event after the State of the Union speech in America, when Katie Britt, the senator from Alabama, she was going to do the pro-Trump speech after the Biden speech. And she did it in such a hammy way, a little bit too emotional, a little bit too breathless, that everybody, and most importantly, Trump followers, were stunned and were like, what the hell is this? And for a moment, and she did this by accident, she was just overacting, she revealed to what extent this whole language and rhetoric, in her case, of Trump politics, is actually a performance. Because it claims to be genuine. It claims to be, this is the true feelings. This is our feelings about the border. The way she was talking about the border was slightly off, and it made you realize to what extent the whole thing is empty and something of an act. I mean, if we're going to get into pretentious dramatic theory, I mean, it's what people like Brecht mean by Entfremdungseffect. And we've got to understand that Delma spent the 20s completely immersed in the world of cabaret So these ideas would have been all around him. He was living in Berlin in the 20s as a reporter. So there's no way, he writes about Brecht in some historical work. There's no way he didn't know about these ideas because everybody was talking about it. And he had a lot of people from the German cabaret scene working on his radios. They're the ones playing these different characters. So it's very subtle. I mean, it's like, if you go back to social media, it's that moment when you look over your tweets, which you should never do from a year ago, or your Facebook posts, which were delivered with such passion and vigor, and you look back and you go, I sound so fake. I sound so as if I'm acting. I thought that was me. So he's looking for this sort of distancing effect. The next thing, though, so it's break the Nazi monopoly on emotion, get this space in between people and the roles they've been performing. And once you've created that space, you can start inserting truth in a different type of community. So the reason I decided to write the book is when I realized that from 43 onwards, Delmer switched from doing the sort of deceptive media, where he was creating characters essentially, to actually a very interesting arrangement where he was broadcasting media that was British disguised as Nazi, but people listening to it were meant to know it was British disguised as Nazis, and they were meant to know the British knew. He's creating a safe space for people to listen to content, but it was full within this sort of masquerade. The content, well, the most successful content was true. He set up this vast data gathering exercise about the lives of soldiers on the front through interviews with POWs, listening to recordings of POWs talking to each other in POW camps when they weren't aware of it. This was British intelligence was doing this all the time. Opening letters of Nazi officials to their relatives, newspaper cuttings, reports from partisans who would tell them the littlest details about like which very some corrupt Nazi officer had brought themselves, or what venereal disease the local prostitute had in Calais that everybody was sleeping with. And by having this incredible detail about lives of soldiers and civilians, which he would then broadcast in incredible detail, he would welcome people into a world where now they've got a bit distant from Nazi propaganda, they could start to think about their own self-interest. Now, here was a station that was giving details about their lives, that seemed to care about them, even though they knew it was the British behind it, that could provide them information that was useful. So people could start acting in their own self-interest, not in the Nazis. So in his case, that means disobeying Nazi orders, disobeying Nazi orders, defecting, surrendering, or just generally being like an inefficient member of the folk. You want to break that bond between the leader and the people. And that could be many things today. If we're talking about a dictatorship, it would be to get people to stop contributing to the dictator's slush fund, or if you're talking about soldiers, it's more obvious what you want to stop doing. But he was very interested in behavioral change. He wanted to change the emotional structure to lead to a point where people could start acting in their own interests and in a weird way express their individuality again. All the time giving them a new group to be part of. So never saying go and be a rebel by yourself, but saying kind of like all soldiers are sabotaging their boats. You'd never say you go sabotage your boat. You just go, there's a lot of boat sabotage going on. There's another report of boat sabotage in Calais. This is what they did. Isn't it terrible? Would be the way he presents it. So that was kind of the arc, from understanding the emotional and performative grip the Nazis had through to people being able to act in their own self-interest, which was always, again, coming back to this central idea, was also a form of theatre. He was always aware that even when you're yourself, you're still performing in some way, but you're the one who decides why you're doing it and to what end. But he was giving people back agency, to use today's sort of fluffy media talk. His media was designed to get you at the end to start acting independently again. You know, it wasn't just trying to convince you that democracy good, fascism bad. It was trying to get you to act democratic, I'd say. So that was kind of the arc that he was working through. And it's interesting, you know, I look at counter-propaganda today, and there are elements of this that I've seen in my various research. You know, people believe conspiracy theories when they don't have a sense of agency. You know, we're very aware of things like engagement media and all these sort of clever things being devised at CUNY in New York could be ways to counterbalance that. So it's interesting, like people who today think about what to do about these issues were aware of these questions. But the people doing that would never put it next to, you know, aggressive, smutty, funny porn, which is what Delmer did. He put it all together from the visceral anger. And there was a lot of porn in his shows, I should mention to those so inclined to watch. I'm not sure. But
historical interest only, yes.
Historical interest. So he was doing the whole thing from visceral anger and smut through to recovering your agency as a democratic citizen and putting it into one package. And in that sense, I mean, I don't know. I think there was really something quite remarkable in what he did. Because coming back to the start of our meandering conversation, or my meanders, it did start with this visceral and very personal understanding about why propaganda was attractive in the first place.
And that, to sort of close it off, is actually extraordinary, because you talk about a vast amount of time and resources in wartime where these things are an absolute premium. You can imagine within any bureaucracy, whether it's military, administrative, you have to fight pretty hard to make your case to do something as, I would assume, as expensive as this. And it's quite a wild kind of approach. How did he get it through? And, you know, we see similar things in, you know, the code breakers as well. You see extraordinary characters coming to the surface and sort of being allowed to do their thing in a way which often would go counter to the fairly sort of stuffy verticals that you might find within the military and so on.
So, I mean, the two words that allowed him to do this was actually Ian Fleming. So there is a point when Delmer is almost shut down because, you know, he's essentially broadcasting pornography in the king's, you know, for the king's coin. and exactly that is like there's an official finds out about this, one of a very, very senior official, Sir Stafford Cripps, and he storms into Eden's office and says, if this is the way we're going to win the war, I'd rather we'd not win it. But when Delmer is at a low ebb, the person who sees potential in his first shows, because he starts off with one radio station and ends up being head of special operations, running dozens of them. I mean, dozens of them if you accumulate it over the whole time. I mean, they're constantly opening and shutting down. But, you know, he becomes a big boss by D-Day. But he starts with somebody doing something very experimental on the fringes. And the person who sees potential in this and gives him and empowers him is Ian Fleming at the Admiralty. They've known each other for a while. They've been to Moscow together. They've had various adventures together. And Fleming basically says, what you're doing is going to be really useful for us. We need to undermine the morale of submarine boats. It's the you know, one of the really important moments in the submarine wars. And he's like, look, we need to find a way to influencing submarine sailors, submarine sailors, is that right? Submarine men and women,
submariners.
Submariners, there you go. To influence submariners. So he's always said, look, what you're doing, I mean, he sees a very, very precise need for it. And it's the Admiralty who enable him, give him a ton of money, intelligence, which is even more important, and kind of clear aims. You know, it's not like you need you to do this. You know, they had very, very definitive asks. Down to, you know, they needed his help in very specific battles to sort of, you know, demoralize or confuse the enemy. But Delmer immediately says, sure, we'll do something for the submariners, but his vision right from the start is, no, we want to do something for everyone. So even though a lot of his bigger stations are military stations, where there's a show aimed at submariners, he always saw the bigger picture. He was like, actually, German civilians will want to listen to this to find out what's really going on the front. So he's never doing, he's actually always, his actually vision of the audience is actually quite broad usually. And yet specific in the sense that he's going for people who are not the hardcore Nazis. He knows he won't get to them. Not the kind of hardcore rebels. They don't need, they're listening to the BBC already. He's going for people who are part of the group, conformist, going along, but have some level of discomfort with what's happening, some sort of gripe. Which, look, I mean, looking at the sociology, which I quote, of Russia at the moment, that's going to be the biggest group as well. You're not going to get to the 10% crazies. You're not going to get to the 15% who are genuinely in love with Putin. What you're looking at is that 40% who are like going along with things, acquiescing, but have resentments and doubts. That's, well, no one's trying to actually talk to them in Russia, and Delma felt nobody was trying to talk to them in Germany. So he's not, they're not, even though his stations are often, you know, they were officially, you know, the station of the armed forces, he was always thinking about the bigger community. Also, everyone had a relative in the armed forces, so it was quite personal for people.
Yeah.
So Ian Fleming is the simple answer, is what made it possible.
And fascinating to see what came after that. I can't think of any equivalents, and I know you have to run off, but I can't think of too many equivalents in the current one, except perhaps the interviews of Zolkin. But that is a different purpose. That's trying to immunize the Ukrainian population by allowing them to hear Ukrainian POWs in their own words, and the just sheer nonsense many of them come up with as to why they're there, why they're fighting. That's a slightly different. That's sort of almost like an anti-propaganda, an antidote to propaganda. But I guess we don't consider ourselves at war with Russia. Russia may consider themselves at war with us. We're perhaps not even thinking about such grand schemes as Delma's.
Look, in the 21st century, it's going to be, we're already poured way into it. But look, I think now it's not, I think sort of everybody now agrees we're in an era of great power competition. You know, there's a slew of books about to come out about this. So I think mentally we've grasped that, oh, this is going to be a knife fight of the 21st century. It's not going to be like the Cold War. It's going to be different. There's going to be both integration and competition, which is going to be dirty, nasty, full of spycraft, cybercraft, and information craft. And the other side have built up political warfare capacities. It's not just about Ukraine. It's about how we compete in the 21st century. We're going to have to relearn the art of political warfare. I mean, Delma was part of the political warfare executive. We're going to have to relearn the art of economic warfare. That's just the world that we're entering. So we're going to have to find out what our rules are, what our doctrine is. We're not going to do the same thing as the other side do. I think Delma has some provocations about how we might approach this, but it means being effects-driven. It means thinking about winning. It's not what journalism should do. Journalism has to do what journalism does, and God bless it. This is not that. This is something that has a huge informational component, but whose aim is to win. And we don't even, we even struggle to have a language for it. I mean, sometimes this is where stratcoms gets bundled into. And that's us approaching the reality that we need to get to. I like the old term political warfare. I don't see why we can't use it. But you're right. For any of this to happen, there is a watershed moment where we go, we're at war. Not the kind of war we've known before. There have been many types of war. You don't want to use the word war, use one of hyper competition, sharp power. Let's find a word for it that we're all comfortable with. But to compete, we need new doctrines, new institutions, new tools, almost new professions. And I think we're getting there. I think the mind of nations and states has understood the challenge, but the body is yet to react. We still don't have who's meant to be doing this is a real question. Like, whose job is this? It's not media's job, by the way. Media does something else, which is very important. This is something different. So, you know, I think we're going to have to unearth the lessons, good and bad, of what Delma did, of what we learned in the Cold War. And we're going to try to understand what we need today.
And that's the connection to marketing. Test and learn, try stuff, break stuff, fail. Thank you so much, Peter.
My pleasure.
Huge pleasure. Great
Okay,
speaking to
ciao,
you.
bye-bye.